You're going to wait just about one more minute. We have a few more people to join us. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Weeds and Invasives, sort of the road tour across Iowa. My name is Pat Sauer. I am the Executive Director of the Iowa Stormwater Education Partnership. Ben is joining us behind the scenes to manage this webinar. I am pleased to introduce Tom Rosberg. He is going to get us started today in giving us a brief introduction on this tour in eastern Iowa. And the plan is that we will start and stop the video as we move from different locations on the site and discuss different plants. So feel free to use your chat area, or you can unmute yourself if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, and it'd be nice if you'd like to share some information as well. So welcome everyone, and I will now hand it over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Pat. Good morning, everybody. Welcome again to this second webinar here. We were in eastern Iowa last week. I had chosen a site that is an old field, early successional old field. When we're looking at weedy species, mostly non-native weedy species, looking for invasive species, one place you can be sure to find sort of a good assortment of those types of species would be in an early successional environment. And so this site is a site where agriculture was done, has been done, for many, many years. And for various reasons, agriculture stopped, and succession is beginning then to move that community into a new direction. But because of the disturbance, the bare ground, and no doubt, lots of weed seeds in the seed bank, there's just an abundance of weedy species on this site. So it's a good site for us to take a look at. And I would just reiterate what Pat was saying, when we stop and discuss briefly the species that we've just looked at, I sure encourage, questions and comments from all of you. We'll try to talk a little bit about some of the control methods that might work for those species. So I guess we're ready to get started.
All right, give me 1 second here to get it pulled up. All right, so you should see a black screen now. And Tom, let me know if you can hear sound when I start it. Just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down and we'll go from there. So here we go. Thanks, Tom.
All right, good morning. This is Tom Rosberg. We're making our second video for the Stormwater Weeds webinar series. It's June 16th. We're standing in an early successional old field. This is an agricultural field that has been abandoned. So early successional means that it's in the early stage of succession. And that usually means there's lots of ruderal species, lots of weedy species. We're in eastern Iowa. So let's take a look at what we have. There's ruderal species weeds all around us here. The first one I'm going to point out here is this one right in front of me. This is sourdock, curly sourdock. This is one we talked about last month, but we didn't see it in fruit and flower. Again, this one has the lower leaves on the stem, and basal leaves have a really wavy, kind of crinkly margin to the leaves here. That's pretty distinctive for it. The fruits of all of the sourdock species are little winged structures. If you look at this real close up through a hand lens, for example, you'll see that there's little wing-like structures that are attached to the fruit. And sourdock makes lots and lots of fruit, so it's just packed with them right here. Again, that's a characteristic of a rudal species, and really successional species, is to produce lots and lots of seeds. All right, then another one, a couple more right here, right around me. No, again, so sourdock is non-native, but two native species right here are common ragweed. This one right here with the opposite leaves that are divided into compound leaflets. And then giant ragweed right over here. Again with opposite leaves. These are simple leaves though, and just deeply divided. So the two ragweed species, common and giant. Another non-native weedy species, there's several right through here. I'll just grab one. This one right here, this is prickly lettuce, Lactuca cereola. So it's pretty distinctive. It tends to have these leaves that have prickles on the bottom side of the leaf along the mid vein. Kind of maybe see those there. Right along there where my thumb runs. It's pretty distinctive prickles there, and then also usually some prickles that are along the leaf margin as well. You see the leaves, they tend to be, on this plant, is showing them being bent and sort of being turned as the leaves come off of the stem, so that the surfaces are actually vertical. You see that quite often with this species. Prickly lettuce also has some white sap. So you pull the leaf off, you'll see white sap oozing out. It's in the Asteraceae family, and again in a tribe that has the white sap, which includes all kinds of species of lettuce. Then one right in front of it here is a pepperweed. Pepperweed is Lepidium. This is a native species. There's two species of Lepidium that are very similar. And the way I tell them apart is to take a look at the stem where the fruits are attached. I'm not sure I can see this with my hand lens because I usually use a scope. But what I'm looking for are the hairs that are on the stem where the fruits are attached here, and whether those hairs are curved over or whether they are not curved over, they're just short and straight. That'll be the the easiest characteristic used to distinguish between Lepidium virginicum and Lepidium densiflorum. This one is the native species. Okay, I'm going to have...
Tom, did I mess up that last one there? You're muted.
So yeah, on the I corrected that for you, I think, on the word file I sent back to you. Is that what you mean? The name of it?
Yeah. Did I have it wrong in here?
I'm not sure I can...
I think on your...
Oh, that's okay.
You called it Lepidium foliatum, I think. I'm looking at it. Where'd it go? Yeah, you called it Lepidium latifolium on the PDF that you sent to me. So I don't know for sure which one of the two native species that was, because I couldn't really see the hairs well enough with the hand lens. But again, there are two native species of pepperweed. And again, the hairs are the key there. It's about the best way to distinguish them. If you look at the upper stem, again, when it's in fruit, where those fruits are coming off the stem, you'll see lots of hairs. And if those hairs are curved over, if they are long enough to be kind of curved over, then that's going to be Lepidium virginicum. That's Virginia pepperweed. if the hairs are shorter and straight, and actually they're so short that they more or less resemble little bumps, but they are little short hairs, but they're not curved over, that's Lepidium densiflorum, common pepperweed. There are two other pepperweeds in Iowa that are non-native, Lepidium campestre and Lepidium perfoliatum. Those are non-native species, as I said. Those two are separated from the two native ones by the leaf bases. On the leaf bases of the two native species, there are no auricles, or there's no clasping base to those leaves. The leaves are attached right to the stem without any kind of a clasping base. The other two species, campestre and perfoliatum, are either have some auricles that kind of clasp the stem. Now that would be Lepidium campestre, or the bases of the upper stem leaves are perfoliate, which means that the leaves are attached to each other and the stem goes through that attachment of the leaves, and that would be Lepidium perfoliatum. They're weedy species, but they're not really ever much of a problem. Again, if you've got the native species, it's because you've got an early successional kind of an environment there.
So yeah, Tom, go ahead, Ben. Go ahead, Ben.
No, were you going to ask the questions, Pat? Go ahead. It's fine.
Yes, I was. So there, Joseph would like to know, where are you in eastern Iowa? Number one. Number two, how long do you think this field has been left untouched to grow into this succession?
Yeah, so I actually worked on this site last year, working on it, doing a floristic survey. So that's how I knew about it. It was in the first year of early successional growth last year. So this growing season is its second year. So we're seeing, essentially the second year's worth of growth here. That's why there's so many of them, probably. All I can tell you is that's in someplace in Lynn County.
Why Tom can't give you specifics is because it's a probably a protected site.
It's a confidential site in terms of the work I'm doing there and so forth. So I can't say more than that really about it. Just that it's an early successional field someplace in eastern Iowa.
Okay, I think we can move on.
Tom, did you have any other comments on the first couple plants we saw?
No, I think that pretty much is it. Again, for Rumex crispus curly dock, we talked a little bit about control of it. Again, it's going to need to be stopping the seed from being produced, of course, but it is a perennial species though, so you're going to have to use an herbicide on it. But again, that's usually not terribly invasive. You can find places, I think, maybe in wetland or wet soils where you may have populations approaching that. I would say some kind of spot spraying with a broadleaf herbicide would probably be the best strategy. Again, when the leaves are basal leaves are present, the stem leaves are much reduced in size, so you'd have to be early enough in the growing season that the basal leaves are still there and still green and photosynthetic.
Sounds good. I'm going to keep going.
Okay, we're going to have 3 more species here to take a look at. We'll start with this big one right back here. This is poison hemlock. You can see it's a tall species, and it's in the Apiaceae, or the parsley family, so that means the flowers are in compound umbels. The flowers are very, very tiny. I'm pointing at some flowers right there, a group of small flowers right there. This is a group of umbels right here. And then those umbels are also grouped together in some umbels, this bigger structure. That's why there's 2 sets of them there. So they're compound umbels. The leaves are always, on most of the parsley family plants, are often very finely divided into compound leaves with small leaflets. These are, get a bigger leaf here. Let's see, these are going to be 3 times divided. So we have a primary rachis here, secondary rachis, and then the leaflets are actually on the 3rd or tertiary rachis, this line of leaflets right here and this stem right here. So 3 times divided, very finely divided. The stem is usually got this sort of purplish kind of a shade to it. Kind of see there's some spots and purplish spots. Very poisonous plant. Poison hemlock is Cicuta maculata. It's becoming more and more common. I was at a site over the weekend where it was just all over the place. It was growing in the roadsides, along the railroad lines, any kind of disturbed area, road ditches. It's becoming more and more of a problem. I would say it's becoming an invasive species. Another one that's equally just as bad and invasive are the sweet clovers. There's 2 species, although I think they're going to probably be combined together as one species, just with variation in the color of the flower. So this is traditionally has been known as yellow sweet clover, and there's another one that's called white sweet clover with white flowers. They're probably going to be again lumped into the same species in the future here. Sweet clover is a biennial, like the poison hemlock. So again, we talked about biennials. They grow for 2 years, the second year producing abundant amounts of flowers and seeds, and then die. Sweet clover has got compound leaves with 3 leaflets, common for many of the legume species. So there's a single leaf right there with 3 leaflets. Has a really deep taproot, so it can be difficult to pull. Again, like all biennials and annuals, the best way to control these invasive species, again, whether it's the hemlock or the sweet clover here, is to prevent it from ever going to fruit and to seed. This one here is obviously in flower and is going to be making seeds and fruit soon, so it's the time to mow it right now. Then another one right in front of me here is this one. This is a native weedy species. This one is frost aster, Symphyotrichum pilosum. So it's an aster, and the reason I know it's an aster is because of the way the branching occurs here. Lots of branching in the shape of the leaves. The stem is very hairy, a lot of pubescence on it. So it's a native species, so it's again supposed to be here, but it is one of the most weedy of the aster species. It'll produce small white flowers in the fall. And we'll probably see some of that in flower later then.
Okay, all right. So we'll pause at this point. So let's see, here is a question. Do you know what the ecological site ID is for this site, landform setting?
Okay, I'm not sure what that refers to. It is a floodplain, I can tell you that, a small floodplain along a small stream. So I'm not familiar with, I guess, what the question is referring to, ecological site number or something.
Ecological site ID for this site. So Joseph, maybe if you could in the chat area be a little more specific on what you're referring to. So, and a question on both of the weedy species that you covered. So you were talking about mowing. So would this be going in and mowing this entire area, or are you spot mowing or spot trimming?
What I do is spot mowing. Now I need to back up too real quick, and I just heard myself miss ID that poison hemlock. It's Conium maculatum, not Cicuta. Cicuta is another hemlock species. But it's a native species, like water hemlock. So it's just a misspoken there. Conium maculatum is the scientific name for poison hemlock, which is the non-native, really bad one there, as I was pointing out. But I would do spot mowing. I just mowed sweet clover on my farm right here. Yellow sweet clover blooms earlier than white sweet clover. I usually like to wait until it does start to bloom, but then get on it right away. Don't don't delay it too long. Mowing it off, I just mowed it off with the tractor mower. I have a brush cutter I can put down pretty low to the ground, mows it off, at about 2 inches, probably 3 inches, something like that. What I'll do is I'll mow the patches, and I had a couple of rather large patches in a prairie planting that I could just mow with the tractor. And then there are some stray plants that are a little bit further out, and in some other areas I'll go out, probably go out this afternoon with my brush cutter and just hand brush cut those. I tried pulling some the other night as I was, getting some stray plants just here and there. When there were just 2 or 3 plants out in the prairie planting, I don't usually mow those. I'll go and just target those by themselves. And they were pretty difficult to pull. They have a pretty strong taproot, deep taproot, and especially since it's been dry, they're a lot easier to pull, of course, after a rain. So with the recent rains we've been getting, pulling could work. And that, if you can pull, and you're just dealing with a few plants, that is certainly the best way to go. Cutting them off, doesn't guarantee necessarily that they won't grow back. It's possible that they may come back and be a much shorter plant, though, and still try to produce some flowers and some seeds. You can obviously check on that. Any patches that you mown off, you can go back and take a look at. For sweet clover, again, you can usually do pretty well with that kind of manual control. Herbicide might be helpful if you really got some large populations of them. Again, the idea is to deplete the seed bank, really. And I can quick tell a really short story. There was a really bad population of sweet clover at Ames High Prairie. This is a really high quality prairie at the Ames High School, now called Pole Prairie Preserve. Many years ago. This was back, in the 90s, I think, when I was involved with this project. We were trying to figure out a way to deal with that population of sweet clover there. And what we decided to try is actually a practice that you can see recommended online. I just was looking at some sites online, and this same practice is pointed out. But basically, we did a burn early in the growing season of a year. Year one, we'll call it. Year one burned like in March. And the whole point of burning in March was to actually encourage germination of sweet clover plants from the seed bank, because burning will do that. And it's certainly the earlier you burn, the more effective that is probably going to be with sweet clover. So the first year we got all these young sweet clover plants growing. Those were first year plants. And again, as a biennial, those plants are just going to grow vegetatively, producing food and energy reserves that go into the root system. And then the idea was then for the second year to come back and do a strategy, of course, which would be to prevent any of those second year plants from blooming and producing seed. We actually did a second year burn, but later in the growing season. It was about the end of April, 1st of May. And that worked pretty effectively then to kill those second year plants. Now, there were some patches that didn't have enough fuel to effectively burn the second year, so we had to go in and either cut or pull those plants. But that actually worked very well. The sweet clover population that was present then there's no sign of it now. So again, that was just done basically. We didn't use any herbicides. It was just a matter of the right timing in terms of the use of prescribed fire.
So specifics on the sweet clover in one of our questions: do you need to remove the sweet clover plants when it starts blooming?
Well, or some people, if you were just dealing with a small population and hand pulling them, it probably would be a good idea. I've not seen any research that says, in fact, that sweet clover can still mature seeds after it's been pulled out of the ground. I mean, there is some research that suggests that can happen to at least a small extent with some biennial species. Garlic mustard comes to mind there. But if you're dealing with a large population like I had there, and I'm mowing it with a brush cutter, then you're not going to be able to do that at all. You're going to chop those plants up pretty well with a brush cutter, and so I think that's going to effectively prevent any kind of any kind of transfer of energy or nutrients that are in a plant that's been pulled out of the ground, and still being able to utilize those nutrients and food reserves to try to advance those seeds and fruits. To what extent that can happen, again, I haven't seen any science that says it can, but if it can, it would be a very minor amount. I don't think there would be much seed production there. That's why, and especially if you get it when it's just starting to flower. The longer you wait, of course, then the more of a problem you have. If it's already starting to form fruits, then you're probably too late. And then, mowing it, may not be as effective. And again, that may actually be a way in which it could actually still produce seeds even if you just pulled it and left the plants lay, because it wouldn't take very much, of course, to get those seeds all the way. Once the seeds are mature, again, one of the problems with sweet clover is that, and many other legumes, we're going to be talking about burstbook trefoil in a little bit probably, but is that those legume seeds are really hard, have really hard seed coats, and really hard seed coats on seeds really helps to prolong their viability. So sweet clover seeds, birchwood trefoil seeds can remain in the seed bank up to 30 years. So that's why it's so incredibly important not to let anything go to seed. Okay. I think I may have mentioned this last time, but out in Los Hills, where it's impossible to mow with the tractor mower, what land resource managers do out there that I know of, they just they hire Conservation Corps crew, or they have their own crew of maybe 3 or 4 interns, and they give them brush cutters, and they just go out and they brush cut those sweet clover plants. So brush cutting really works well because you can cut it right down near the ground, and that's going to make it even less likely that any kind of regrowth is going to occur from that plant.
All right. I do believe we are ready to restart the video, Ben.
Sounds good.
Okay, we have another group of species here to take a look at. We'll start with this one right here, grass. This one's really pretty easy to identify once you kind of get a look at it and see it a few times. Foxtail barley has this very distinctive spikelet here with the long awns coming off the spikelets. Some little bit of purplish color in those awns there as you kind of look at it in the light. This is a native species to North America, and it is considered to be native to Iowa, but it is a fairly rural species. It likes disturbance. You'll see these usually along roadsides, on the shoulders of roads, usually in fairly damp ground. It likes to have a little bit of moisture. So foxtail barley, this is Hordeum jubatum. Hordeum jubatum. Right behind it here is another native species that is, again, somewhat rural, pretty common to find it. This is one of the fleabanes. So there's a couple of fleabanes. Well, there's probably 4 fleabanes in Iowa, but there's 2 fleabane species, erigeron species, that are real common. And the way to tell those apart is to look at the stem and then pay attention to the hairs on the stem. I'm going to take a look at this with my hand lens to see whether those hairs are pressed down against the stem or whether they're spreading and come off the stem kind of at a right angle rather than being pressed down against the stem. You've got sort of a mixture of both, but they're mostly spreading. The hairs are mostly spreading, coming straight off the stem. That would indicate this is daisy fleabane, Erigeron annuus. Fleabanes are in the Asteraceae family. They bloom way ahead of the asters. They're blooming in the first part of the summer or late part of spring. They have white ray flowers, these white little thin petals here. are the ray flowers, and then yellow disc flowers. They have lots and lots of white ray flowers. So they're always basically white with a yellow center, and again blooming late spring, early summer, as opposed to the asters, which could also have white ray flowers, of course, and yellow centers, but bloom much later in the growing season. No asters are in bloom right now, just the fleabanes. The other fleabane, again, that has the hairs pressed down more so on the stem, is Erigeron strigosus, prairie fleabane. Erigeron annuus, as the name suggests, an annual species, is more of a ruderal species then. Strigosus, the prairie fleabane, is a perennial species. All right, then we're going to take a look at a plant just right over here, not far away. This one is another pretty invasive, I would say invasive species, problematic species. This one is non-native. The other two were native. This is Daucus caryota, the wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace. One that pretty easy to recognize. This one again is in the parsley family. So the leaves on it, like again in the parsley family, are highly divided. Here's a leaf right here. Most of the parsley family leaves also have this sheathing in the lower part of the petiole. You kind of see how broad the petiole is here, with and part of that was wrapping kind of around the stem a little bit there, so a little bit of a sheath. But then you can see the leaves here are divided into leaflets, twice divided. It's just beginning to form some flower buds here, so it's just starting to come into flower, but it'll have an umbel as well, a compound umbel at the top where the flowers will be. Daucus caryota. This is a biennial. Well, it works.
Let's see. I am not seeing any questions on those species. Is there, or would you like to make some comments on management of those species, Tom?
Well, the only one that would be of concern there mainly would be the wild carrot. I think wild carrot is invasive to some extent. I see a lot of prairies, even just grassland areas, brome grasslands that can have quite a bit of wild carrot. And it is, again, a biennial, so it's kind of the same story, of course, as always, with those. Wild carrot can produce up to about 40,000 seeds per plant. So again, that's the strategy of a biennial or an annual species, is to prolong the population by producing so many seeds. So that one, I've had pretty good luck just mowing it when it starts to come into flower. One thing for sure, I think I may have mentioned this with sweet clover, but it'd be very, very much the same thing with wild carrot. I'm very careful not to do this on my farm here. Is you don't want to burn a place that's got a fair amount of biennial weediness every other year. That would be a very very favorable thing for that plant, because that's helping it. Then you burn it one year, that stimulates it to germinate from the seed bank. Then you don't burn it or do anything for a year. It produces seed the second year, and then you burn it again 2 years later. That's just really going to help it along a huge amount. So I'm careful not to do that. Any places that I've got wild carrot, and use a tractor mower, or I'll just, again, if there's not too many, just go out and use a brush cutter and mow it off when it starts to go into flower. And most of the time, that's enough to really set it back. I did that on an area again where I live here, and I'm not seeing any of it coming back this year. Another strategy that I've seen on my own farm here that does work somewhat, and I'll talk more about this later, and this is in an area that's got a reconstructed prairie that's underway. Actually, it's the prairie grasses have been there for quite some time, and I'm adding forbs to it. But the use of a midsummer or late summer fire. that I think can be effective, especially for wild carrots, since that's about the time that it is, again, starting to produce flowers and fruits. So rather than mowing it, you could use a fire to do the same thing. And I think it might actually be more effective in some ways, because then if it does grow back, and I didn't see any coming back in the time when I tried this, but if it does start to come back, again, you'd have the option then of going out in the fall months there, and maybe selectively just, again, cutting it off or using some kind of spot spraying method or something, perhaps, to hit those places where those few plants are coming back. Because again, no seed, can't let any seed form.
Okay, let's see. Here's a question from Kendra. Is there an easy way to tell poison hemlock from wild carrot during early growth when the plants are still small?
That's probably going to be a little bit difficult when the plants are really small. I was doing some work on another project where there was a lot of poison hemlock, Conia maculatum, and I was seeing a lot of small plants coming up from the seed bank, and I was noting that, well, I knew that that's what they were because there was Conia maculatum all around me, so it was pretty obvious that that's what was coming up. Those young plants, going to be pretty hard to separate them from Docus caryota, I think, because at that stage, you don't have much to go on. And both of them have leaves that are pretty well divided. The only thing that might be of hope, I think, is that poison hemlock would tend to have leaves that are 3 times divided, and wild carrot have leaves that are just twice divided.
Okay, let's see. Here's a question from Jennifer. Do we try and remove every single one of these plants from the lands that we work with, or is it okay to have some of any of them at any time, or are there ones that we should always kill?
Well, I guess that's up to you and your management goals to some extent, but knowing that I guess in general, any of the species we've been talking about that I would say are invasive, and so that's going to include poison hemlock and sweet clovers, wild carrot, those 3 at least we've talked about already. Birchfoot trefoil is coming up. I can't see much of a reason for permitting them to continue to have a population present, I guess, unless you just don't have any other plants there that would provide, pollinator plants. I mean, we want native plants instead of those plants, and so rather than any of those non-native Apiaceae plants, the carrots and the hemlock, we'd want golden Alexanders and water parsnip and water hemlock, those species. So, I mean, I would strongly, I guess, suggest that because of their ability to be so invasive and their ability to produce lots of seeds, that I can't see any reason why your long-term goals for a site wouldn't be to try to eradicate the species and get native species there.
Okay, I see that is it for questions now. So Ben, we are ready to start the video again.
Exploring this old field successional area here, and we found a gigantic example here of burdock, common burdock, Arctium minus. This is in the Asteraceae family. It's an easy one to recognize, of course, with the gigantic sort of rhubarb-like leaves, but it's not in the same family as rhubarb. It's in a different family. This one is, again, I think becoming more and more invasive the more I see of it. Really distinctive with, of course, the large leaves. The stem is pretty distinctive there in its striations. And of course it produces large flowers that will turn into fruits that have a lot of sort of spines on them that will really stick well into clothing. You've probably all seen the burdock fruits. They get moved around easily. It is becoming more and more of a problem. I've seen some places up in northwest Iowa in bur oak forests where the understory was just pretty much covered entirely by common burdock. It used to be more sparingly, found. I used to think it was just kind of a non-native species that occurred here and there, but it seems to be becoming more and more invasive, which is unfortunate. Here's another fleabane. We just got done with fleabane. This is the daisy fleabane. Here's another curly sourdock here. It's kind of wrapped in this vine right here. And here's one that we did last month, but now it's in fruit. So if you remember last month we did Yellow Rocket, Barbaria vulgaris, which is one of the mustards. This is what it looks like when it's in fruits, all done flowering. These are all the saliques, the long, narrow fruits of a mustard. Yellow Rocket. We don't really see the leaves much now when it's done. Again, producing seed. As this one is here, it's going to die. And so the leaves are kind of falling off. The plant's going to be done. But this is what it looks like in fruit. Then there's one more over here, a native species that's a real common weedy species, ruderal species. And this is Canyza canadensis, mare's tail or horseweed, a couple common names for it. So this one is, I think, distinctive just in the hairiness of the stem, pretty dense hairs up and down the stem, and then leaves that are really numerous. The leaves are alternate, but they kind of just occur all the way around the stem. The stem is round, so it's not like they're occurring just on one side. Leaves, if you look down at the top of this, leaves are coming off all sides of that stem. So they're kind of a spirally arranged group of leaves. Again, really dense, a lot of leaves. They get more and more dense as we go towards the top. The leaves have pubescence on them, and especially here in the narrow petiole, there's little ciliate hairs, small hairs or cilia that are coming off the margins of that leaf stem, petiole. Canyza canadensis, it's again native species, so it should be here. It's an early successional species. It's here because again it establishes well in disturbed areas, but it is very weedy.
Let's see. Any comment? I don't see any questions, but any comments on management of those species, Tom? Oh, here's a question. Can you talk more about the research you are doing on this site?
Well, I can say what I did. I'm done with that research actually now. Again, that was last field season, and the goal of that research was, like many of my projects actually, it was a complete floristic inventory of the site. And what I did was, I could do on many sites and many projects even this summer, is I go into a landscape area like this and delineate the plant communities that are present. I look at the plant associations, see sort of what's represented there, what kinds of plant communities. This one had this early succession oat field. It had cool season grasslands. It had various kinds of forests. I delineate different kinds of forests based on the structure of the forest, the size of the trees, what successional stage they're at. This was again all on a floodplain, so all of these forests here were generally of a floodplain forest type. There were different wetlands that I found, and again, each of those communities then I delineate. I use ArcGIS and make maps for the owner of the land, in this case, and the people I was doing this for. Make maps that show these different communities, what I'm naming them, and then I do a complete floristic inventory, which means I do compile a species list for every single one of those plant communities. Those species lists then also have the abundance of each species. I do a subjective measurement. By subjective, that means I'm just using a guesstimate of how abundant each species is in each community. every species gets like a sparse, occasional, frequent, or very common classification as to how abundant it is, how many individuals, it's the population size, so to speak. But because I have those data, I have quantitative data on the abundance of each species in each community. I can calculate, I generally do 50 to 60 different variables that describe the ecological condition, describe the conservation value. I use coefficients of conservatism. I use wetland affinity data, the wetland rankings that the National List of Wetland Plants provides, coefficient of conservatism for Iowa plants. And I used all of these as a way, again, of characterizing each of those communities. Each community gets a calculation of all of these 50 to 60 variables. I calculate such things as touristic quality index. I have my own little calculation I use that is, I call it the negativity index, the non-native negativity index. It's a measure of how much negative impact non-native species are having. I calculate the percentage of ruderal species versus late successional species. I look at the proportion of grasses or graminoid species, forb species, woody species. I calculate old growth indices that I've come up with. So it's just a huge suite of variables that I can calculate, again, for each plant community that's been mapped. And this is obviously very useful for any land manager when they are trying to figure out what they've got. Say you've got a 400-acre piece of land, you have this map that shows all the different plant communities, plant associations that are present. I often will combine that then with a map that I generate that shows what the native vegetation was most probably like based on soils. And we can kind of see again, what we've got now versus what, might have been there historically on the native landscape. And then again, it's just a useful tool for the land manager to have this. But that's basically the work I was doing there.
Okay. All right. Oh, very cool. Thank you for explaining. And did you want to comment at all about the management of these species that
let's say the burdock would be the same thing again. It's a biennial. I've got some burdock in a prairie planting here, just a small number, and I just try to go out every year and since there are not very many of them, I'll just use my spade and spade them up, kill them, cut them off below the ground. They're still getting a few coming up, but there's always less and less. In most cases, burdock isn't that abundant that it's really terribly invasive. But I would say that if you've got a woodland, and again, it's most likely they're probably going to be more common in a more of a shaded type of environment, forest environments. That's their native habitat over in Europe. So again, you can probably deal with them plant by plant and just take each plant out. But again, because it's a biennial, again, it's the same story over and over again with those species. You just can't let them go to seed. For horseweed or mare's-tail, I wouldn't worry about native species so much because again, if they're there in large numbers, they're there because it's a rural environment and they're sort of doing their function. Rural native species are going to diminish over time as the successional stage advances to something later. If this is an early successional prairie planting or something, the perennial species that are coming, they're coming more slowly though, are going to eventually outcompete those species. So again, I don't really worry too much or think that the native rural species are that much of a problem. It's the non-native ones.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So Ben, I think we're ready to continue with the video.
This was actually a little unexpected, so the audio is not that great. So no need to let me know in the chat that the audio is not good. We weren't super recording at this point, but we came across something that we'd point out. So here you go.
It takes the twig blows over and just pulls the roots out, creates this huge hole in the ground. Major disturbance. I should go in here.
still alive. Probably grow alive like this, though.
So Tom, you want to shed some light on what we just saw?
Sure. So much of eastern Iowa, and of course much of central Iowa, everything from Ames, over towards eastern Iowa, got pretty well impacted by the derecho, of course, on August 10th, and this floodplain forest area that we were in really has a lot of down trees, and it was so difficult to even get through there, trying to find a way through. We just sort of gave up and said, let's just get the heck out of the forest area, get back to the ag field, because it was almost impossible to find a way through. There was so much down wood you had to be scrambling over. And so as we're doing that, getting back towards the ag field, we saw that root ball. You saw that gigantic root ball. And so that's one of the largest ones I've ever seen. That was a hackberry, pretty large hackberry that completely blown over. And of course, then that pulls the roots out of the ground, and the roots are still holding onto the soil significantly enough to actually pull, a huge amount of soil up out of the ground and create those holes. That's a very important type of disturbance, of course, for forests. We don't see it very often. I guess in Iowa, it's not too often that hardwood trees get blown over like that, but you could see how much soil was still in that root ball. And actually all of the, I don't know if you can see it very well, but when you went around it to the surface side of that root ball, there were still plants, still green herbaceous forbs still growing out of that soil. And the tree is still alive as well. So that's the bottom side of it, of course, there. The other side, you can kind of see there's plants growing up there on top of that thing. There's still a lot of forbs and grasses that are still using that soil. And as I said, the tree is still alive. It has enough roots yet, apparently, because the root ball is still in contact with the soil. So, and at least the leaves were still green on it. And so it's been living as a down tree, a horizontal tree, for at least a year almost now. But it's just interesting to think about all the, the ecology that goes behind that, and how that huge impact of that derecho, how much impact that has on the ecology of these forest systems, because that was a significant amount of pruning of canopies, and I think really changed the structure of a lot of forests. It actually reduced the canopy cover, of course, of many forests, and actually changed what were forests into what I call a woodland, which has less forest canopy cover. A forest has 65% or more canopy cover. A woodland has between 35 and 65% covered by canopy species. So it opened up those forests a fair amount, and so pushed them into a more of a herbaceous type of plant community, where herbaceous species, there you can see, that's the top of it there, I think. But yeah, just one of those interesting things that you don't see too often, but I think is really important from the ecology standpoint of what's happening in our forests.
Very interesting. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Okay, thanks, Ben.
Okay, we have some more species to take a look at. These two species are similar to, and one of them is the same as we looked at last month, but now we can see two species of annual brome side by side here pretty much. I'm going to pull up some of each of them, because now is a good time to distinguish them. So my left hand here, this is Bromus japonicus, an annual, invasive, non-native brome species. And in my right hand here, this is Bromus tectorum. Again, in the same category, an annual, non-native, invasive brome species. You see the Bromus tectorum is an earlier species in terms of its phenology, and it produces fruits earlier, dries out sooner. Again, these are annuals, so as soon as they're done making their seeds, they're going to die. And Bromus tectrum here goes by the name of downy chess. This is going to start to die, and that's why we're seeing it in more dried out condition, whereas Japanese brome here is still pretty green. So this time of year it's pretty easy to distinguish these two species. As far as their invasiveness though and their ecology goes, they're both in the same category. They're both really problematic species. It doesn't matter which one you've got. If you've got either of these, you've got a problem. They can become really an abundant species in the herb layer and cause problems again for native biodiversity. Okay. All right, let's take a look again. We're moving down.
Do you want to talk about those two before we move on?
Questions. Those are species that I think they tend to be more problematic in thinner soils, drier soils, sandier soils, low fertility soils, and they obviously become much more of a problem, especially Bromus tectrum as you go further west. We talked a little bit about some of the control methods last week. I think when we looked at Japanese brome, that's the one that we had last week. There are different things that are recommended. Again, burning at the right time can be helpful in terms of burning up seed. That's one of the strategies. Even grazing can be used. Of course, that's probably not a very useful thing in Iowa. And herbicides. Species like this, again, are going to be a combination of strategies and stresses that you need to come to bear on those plant populations, I think, to really be effective in controlling those species. They're probably going to be most problem in early stages of a prairie planting.
Tom, I have a question for you. You touched on grazing as a management method, and not to get too personal about animals, but if they were to graze and eat some of these seeds, are the seeds more or less destroyed in their digestive systems when they defecate, or does the potential exist that they can, that the seed may survive that whole digestive tract environment?
Right, that's a good question. And I don't know for sure about these two bromes. There's certainly probably less likelihood that they're going to survive a digestive pathway through a grazer. Usually the plants that do survive, fruits that are designed to be dispersed through the digestive system of a grazer, we call that endozochory, and those are usually seeds that are contained in fruits. The fruits are designed to increase the passageway of the food item through the digestive system. There's laxatives in those fruits to increase the time, decrease the amount of time, so increase the rate at which that food passes through. Usually those seeds have some harder seed coats. The grasses don't have any of that kind of protection, generally speaking. Although famous ecologist by the name of, I think Jansen was his last name, did describe grass dispersal in that way, that grasses can be dispersed through the digestive system, and it's not the fruits that entice the animals to eat the plants, but it's the foliage, just the leaves, of course. And as animals are grazing on the leaves, they will invariably consume some of the fruits and seeds too. I don't know if he actually did any work on the idea of how well those seeds can actually survive that. So that I can't say for sure. There's research. I'm looking at my other computer here and just looking at some research that has been published, at least on this species. They do talk about spring grazing as effective control. Again, you're just trying to, if you're grazing it early enough in the spring, you're going to reduce the amount of seed production, basically. So the idea is to graze it as it's first coming up, when it's first producing some leaves, and it comes up early. So at that time of the year, grazers will probably be apt to actually use that plant. So the idea there is the early spring targeted grazing to stress those plants. Since they're an annual plant, I think that's one of the ideas there, is that grazers can really have a pretty strong effect on it, because as they graze the leaves off of these annual bromes, they're not going to have that perennial root system to help them cope with that stress. And so you can pretty much do the same thing by grazing as you would do if you went in there and mowed it or something like that. You can prevent or reduce the amount of seed.
And thank you. We do have a question. What was the management of the field before it was left fallow? Tilled a lot, tiled, fertilizer use?
Well, I can't say for sure because I don't know the complete history. I just know it was an agricultural row crop field. So I'm assuming that it was, it was tilled. Again, we're talking about a floodplain, so I doubt that conservation tillage, was a strong or high priority, but I really can't say for sure. But certainly repeated tilling, and I'm sure since it was an agricultural field, herbicides were probably used. You see, that doesn't really affect or change the abundance of seeds in the seed bank, though. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of ruderal species coming up here. It's hard for you to get a sense of that from the video, perhaps, but there's just thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of weedy species here, the plants themselves. So nonetheless, there were still a lot of seeds in the seed bank. And that's the thing, again, is that, most of these rural species, it doesn't take very many of them to produce lots of seeds, and their seeds are often pretty long-lived. They can stay in the soil seed bank for probably tens of years at least. So I'm assuming it was managed as a conventional row crop field.
Thank you, Tom. All right, Ben, I think we're ready to continue with the video.
Let's take a look again. We're moving down through this early successional field here. It's opening out into a kind of a floodplain area here along a stream. We're going to see if we can find some wetland plants. And this is one that does occur in fairly wet soils, certainly on floodplain sites. Some of these wet soil species, again, are similar to species you'd find in stormwater basins or urban areas. This is Canada thistle. I'm guessing some of you certainly know this species, run into it before. Starting to produce flower heads here. They'll have purplish flowers in another few days probably. Here's the plant in terms of stem, pretty hairless. The leaves down here, of course, thistles are always got some prickles on the leaves. But we talked about this, I think, last month. And here again, I'm going to show you the ventral surface of these leaves here. Because on the non-native, and most of them are invasive, the non-native thistles like Canada thistle, bull thistle, musk thistle, the ventral side of the leaf is pretty glabrous. Sometimes Canada thistle can have a few cobwebby kind of hairs, especially when the plant's younger. But this one is pretty far along here. It's starting to produce flowers. Don't see any pubescence at all on the ventral side of these leaves. That is contradictory to the native thistles. The native thistles, like tall thistle and field thistle, they'll have a bigger leaf generally than Canada thistle, but they'll have really dense white hairs that makes the ventral side of the stem look very white compared to the top. That's a good way again to separate any of the native thistles that have the hairy pubescence, separate them from the non-native thistles, which are the ones you want to get rid of. The native thistles should be here. Canada thistle, it's a perennial. It establishes dense patches through rhizomes, interconnected horizontal stems below ground. So it can be a very problematic species to deal with. We'll talk about some of the control methods that we can use during the webinar. We stopped here to...
Hey, I'll hand it over to you, Tom, for management.
All right, so Canada thistle, yes, that is a pretty nasty one. and there's been a lot of research done on it. So you could certainly find a lot of information if you just search the web. What I can just speak from my own experience. I mean, I've had Canada thistle problems here again where I live, and what I've had the best success with is spraying those populations, since they're usually pretty dense. So you can, go in and be pretty effective with spray. Is to spray them with clopyralid. That is something you can get under the trade name Transline. This is an herbicide that has really good effectiveness against both species in the aster family, such as the thistle, or Fabaceae, the legume or pea family. So we'll see that clopyralid is often used for Canada thistle and also used for crown vetch, for example. And research has shown pretty clearly that the best time to spray Canada thistle is in the fall. And so what I like to do, and this is going to be the same strategy for some other species as well, is to mow them off. Again, if they're going in a patch, use a tractor and brush mower, and mow them off before they go into any kind of flower stage. So again, just as you're starting to see some flower buds form, mow them off so you don't produce any seeds. Now they're perennial, of course, and so you're not going to kill the plants. Or again, with a perennial, the idea is that you do have to really kill the plant and the root system. But preventing any seeds from going from being formed is good as well, because you don't want seeds out there, staying viable in the seed bank. But if you mow them off in the summer, then when they're going to grow back, of course, as they grow back in the late summer and you should go into the fall months, then they're at sort of a really good stage to spray. They'll be tall enough. There'll be enough foliage there to get the herbicide on. And I think the research again has shown that fall is very effective. I think what's happening again is that in the fall, when you put the herbicide again, and its effect on the plant is just more effective, because you combine that stress of the herbicide with it going into the winter season, and again reducing the ability, if the herbicide doesn't quite kill the plant, it certainly stresses it enough so that it's much weaker and unable then to make it through the cold months. Remember, plants do have to maintain metabolic activity in the root system during the winter time. Those perennial root systems have to stay alive. So it's in a dormant stage from the standpoint of there's no above ground shoot or anything, but there's still living cells, and the need for energy and metabolism down there in those roots. And so if it's weakened by the stress of the herbicide, that combined with the cold temperatures, I think again has shown that fall application is more effective than applying it, for example, in the spring. But that's what I would recommend for it.
Yeah. All right, I think we can continue with our video, Ben.
We stopped here to show you one of the native thistles. We were just talking about Canada thistle, and here we have a native thistle. So again, it has kind of a similar looking leaf. This one's got really divided leaves, but if you turn it over and look at the underside, you can see it's really white. That whiteness again is caused by a short, dense layer of hairs on the bottom side of the leaf. And all the native thistles are going to have that whiteness that you're going to run into. At least the native thistles that are common enough that you'd run into. There are two of them that look somewhat like this, that have the divided leaves and have some pubescence on the stems here that you'll run into over most of Iowa. This one is field thistle, Cirsium discolor. It's recognized again because the leaves are deeply divided into these lobes here. The other one, Cirsium altissimum, tall thistle, is much less divided. It's In some cases, some leaves really aren't divided at all. It's more of just a broadly elliptic leaf. Sometimes there'll be short little lobes in them. It's not quite as common as field thistle is, so this is the one that you're probably going to see most often. But this is a native thistle. And again, as a native thistle, it is somewhat ruderal because it does kind of colonize disturbed areas. But being a native species, again, it's supposed to do that. That's its function in the ecosystem. And it's not going to become invasive. It's not going to take over an area. All right, then there's a few other species around here that we can take a look at. Here is reed canary grass. So we mentioned this, I think, last month as well. Reed canary grass wasn't producing any flowers. These are now producing flowers and spikelets. So recognized again by this really dense column of spikelets at the top of the plant. Reed canary grass also has generally a light colored base on the bottom of the leaf blade here. If I pull this leaf back a little bit, here again is where the sheath is this part that surrounds the stem, and then this is the blade where the sheath and the blade come together right here. This is called the collar. The collar in reed canary grass is usually very light in color, has this kind of just really light green or cream color to it. Kind of see it on both sides there. And the ligule, which is a membranous structure that sits at the base of the blade, is very conspicuous. A very tall membranous structure right there. Reed canary grass has pretty broad leaves as grass leaves go. And remember, reed canary grass is, as a species, Phalaris rhodonacea, is native to North America, at least the northern parts of North America. We don't know for sure exactly how far south it was. It's considered to be a species that is native to Iowa. But what we have on our landscapes, what we see almost invariably is not the native version of reed canary grass, but a European cultivar, a cultivar that was developed in Europe for erosion control, for planting in grass waterways, help control the movement of water on the landscape. That cultivar is, again, being very aggressive and being very vegetative in its growth, is what's spread throughout most of the landscape and has become an invasive species. And we just looking around, we can see some of the other species that we have been already talked about. Here's lots of that foxtail barley or squirrel-tail barley. Here is the prickly lettuce. There's just thousands and thousands of this plant. Here's the daisy fleabane we saw earlier. Here's the frost aster we talked about earlier. And low down on the ground here, just thousands and thousands of horseweed plants.
Hey, we have a question. Please talk about strategies to remove small patches of reed canary grass that are invading prairies. Massive areas of reed canary grass, especially if it is in an area that is spilling sediment, laden runoff, or floodwaters into it, are so hard to deal with.
Yes, that could be an hour-long lecture, I'm sure, pretty much. So I'll make it short. Well, one thing I would, I guess, invite you to do is to, if you're interested in reed canary grass control, and we've got kind of two questions there. You've got the smaller, maybe, just clumps here and there versus, more of a large, widespread, dense population. This is a species that's certainly a problem in wet prairies or sedge meadows. If you're interested in seeing an experiment I've been conducting for the last couple of years and is continuing on for a couple more years, The Iowa Prairie Conference coming up at the beginning, well, it's the end of July and the first day of August. July 31st is a Zoom session with some presentations online, and then on Sunday, August 1st, there's field trips. And I'm leading a field trip to my study site in Madison County, where I've been conducting this research on the restoration of a sedge meadow. And what we're seeing there is, I think, pretty convincing proof that there is a hope. There's a strategy that seems to be working. And I'll just say that we're looking at 7 different ways of dealing with reed canary grass. There's 8 plots in a block, and there's 8 different treatments, and one of those is a control treatment, so nothing is happening there. But the other 7 have various combinations of spring fire, mowing, and the use of clethodim, which is a herbicide designed to kill grasses only. And we choose clethodim because it does have this specificity on grasses, but it doesn't kill any sedges. Sedges are a different family from grasses, and so there's enough distinction between a sedge and a grass, physiologically speaking. I can't tell you for sure how clethodim is working. I'd have to look that up, but clethodim, again, does not have any negative effects on sedges. It does have negative effects on grasses. And what I'm seeing is, long story short, is the combination of spring fire and clethodim about 1 month later, maybe 3 weeks later, as the regrowth of the grasses occurs, seems to be having the most effect and might be the most useful strategy. That's now, in that situation, we're dealing with a chronic problem of reed canary grass. I mean, it is a dense population. It is the most abundant species on this sedge meadow. But there are remnant sedge meadow species still hanging on and present in there, sedges and other forb species. And what we're seeing is that in that plot that has the spring fire combined with clethodim, seeing the most promise. The reduction of reed canary grass is significant, and the regrowth of sedge meadow species is looking really great. Now, if you had just clumps of it, like we see in this rural environment here, these are just some scattered clumps. I would say, you could easily go in there, if you're dealing with just, a fairly small site, at least. And, I would probably just go in there and brush cut those, several times. Another strategy that I have used in my own farm here, a non-chemical one, and with a smaller amount of area, but still a fair amount of reed canary grass, is I simply just mowed it was part of a prairie reconstruction that I did, and the lower and wetter portion of that prairie, had this reed canary grass. So I just mowed that 3 times during the growing season in 2017. About every month I went in there and mowed it. And then in the spring, after the 3rd mowing, about a month maybe later, end of September or so, I burned it because there was a lot of litter. I mowed it 3 times, and all that litter that came from the mowing was piling up there and staying, of course, was still there. And so there was a really good fuel load there, and I had a very good successful fire. Well, when I burned it at the end of September, the reed canary grass was coming up now for the 4th time. It was trying to come back again from all those mowings, and it was the 4th time. Its life had been interrupted. It had been interrupted 3 other times by mowing, and now it's getting interrupted by being top killed by a fall burn. And I've seen in that, it's anecdotal. I don't have data, but I can take you to it and show it to you. I see almost no reed canary grass there now. Just that repeated stress over the one growing season, just stress after stress after stress. The mowing is essentially accomplishes the same thing as burning, at least close enough. Top kills the plants, forces them to regrow. Burning is probably a little bit more effective in doing that because there's some other things that happen with burning, of course. But and that story, basically, again, an anecdotal story, just what I'm trying here. I don't have data to back it up, but is backed up by other reports I've gotten from land resource managers that say that they've noticed along trails that they routinely mow during the summertime just to keep a trail, so that people can hike. But when those trails go through reed canary grass areas, they see that the reed canary grass is pretty much gone from the trail. It doesn't like the repeated top killing that occurs if you would repeatedly, and that's why we're using mowing in the study. We're seeing if again, 3 times, getting mowed 3 times during the growing season might be an effective way of dealing with it. If you have small enough clumps of it, then I think you can deal with it without the herbicide.
Grazing experiments with reed canary grass? That was a question.
There are some, I think. I haven't looked at that literature recently, but I know out at Chautauqua, I think, again, have some anecdotal data that suggests that, by putting cattle out on a wet prairie or a sedge meadow area at the right time in the spring, forcing the cattle basically to eat the reed canary grass, that can, again, it's going to be effective because, again, anything you can do that top kills the plants or stresses the plants. I mean, that's what we need to do. That's what management is about, finding ways to stress the shoot system, the above ground growth of those plants, whether you do it by grazing, mowing, or fire. Usually the more variety of ways in which you do that usually is usually better, because you're not doing the same thing over and over again, and maybe hurting some other species. The point of my research is that I'm trying to find the best way to kill reed canary grass without killing the native sedge meadow species. And in particular, I'm concerned about Calamagrostis canadensis, which is a native grass that also is a co-dominant and important species that is a co-dominant species of the sedges, but it's a grass. So it's going to be susceptible to clethodim. I'm using the mowing and clethodim in the fall as a way of maybe hoping that by maybe using clethodim in the fall, the blue joint, the Calamagrostis, maybe won't be as susceptible to the clethodim at that time, because it's not as physiologically active as what reed canary grass is. But time will tell. That research again has got a couple more years to go yet, at least. But yeah, I think grazing can be used. Grazing can be used. I've done research on grazing cattle in prairies both at Chautauqua and up in northwest Iowa at Kitchener Prairie that have shown clearly that cattle grazing, when used effectively, can be a positive thing for the management of especially reconstructed prairies. And that's usually is helping to remove cool season grasses or helping to improve the diversity of the prairie species.
I'm going to interject quickly, Pat. So we have 20 minutes left in the video and about 35 minutes left in the webinar. So I'm probably going to play 2 bursts here. I'll leave it run for maybe 10 minutes and then stop it at the logical point from there.
Okay, sounds good, Ben.
Okay, here's a species that we saw last month, but it was just in vegetative form. Here we have one that's some plants that are now in fruit, and here's one that's looks like it's done flowering, is starting to form a fruit. This is Trigopogon dubius, goat's beard. So again, this is got really long lance-shaped leaves, really narrowly lance-shaped leaves. That's one thing that's very distinctive about it, of course. The bases kind of flare out a little bit here, a little bit broader, but then kind of a very long tapering tip, almost sword-like. And it produces, again, a flower that's going to look a little bit like a dandelion, hence the fruit here, but much, much larger than a dandelion. What's happening here is the fruits are producing this structure here called a pappus. These bristles up here, kind of plumose bristles that are used in wind dispersal. The fruit is down here at the base, right down here, where this is where the seed is. So the really large dandelion-like fruiting structures, the very narrow, long tapering leaves make it pretty easy to identify goat's beard, Tragopogon dubius. There are a couple species of Tragopogon in Iowa, but Tragopogon dubius is by far the most common one. All right, here we have a species of sow thistle. Sow thistle is in the genus Sonchus. There are a couple of Sonchus species that are fairly common. Sonchus asper is this one, and Sonchus oleoceras is the other one, common sow thistle. They are distinguished by the leaf bases. So on this one, Sonchus asper, the leaf bases down here are rounded. You can see how the edge of this bottom side of this leaf is just rounded, as opposed to the other species that will have an acute point. It will come to a very clear tip or point. So the rounded one like this is Sonchus asper. You recognize the Sonchus again because of the milk. It produces a milky sap. When you pull the leaf back a little bit, we can see some more milk there, oozing out there. And of course the very, very prickly leaf margins. Sow thistle, all the sow thistle species, all the species in Sonchus, the genus, have these very sharp, pointed leaf margins. Spiny sow thistle, Sonchus aspera. It and the Tragopogon dubius are both non-native, but neither of them are, I would say, are terribly invasive. Sonchus aspera probably is leaning a little bit more that way. I've seen some sites where the populations are somewhat large in size. Okay, we're going to review one we did last month because we didn't see it in flower like we do right now. This is wild parsnip, Pastinaca sativa. So again, it is in the Apiaceae or parsley family. We can recognize that again. Remember, if we have compound umbels. So again, each of these small clusters of flowers right here, and there's probably, let me see here, there's probably, well, there's one flower in each of these right here. So each of these is a single flower, but each of these single flowers is attached to a common point right here. And then that umbel is grouped with other umbels attached to a common point right here. A little bit easier to see the compound umbels on parsnip here. Yellow flowers, compound umbels, leaves again they have sheathing at the base. This is again another characteristic of the parsley family. The sheathing at the base of the leaf right here. This wraps around the lower part of the stem where the leaf attaches. And then we've got, again, a compound leaf. These are leaflets right here. This is once divided, once pinnately compound, but with the leaflets, fairly large leaflets. The leaflets themselves are somewhat lobed, small lobes in them, a few teeth. Pretty distinctive, again, in terms of its leaves, the compound umbels. Here it is making fruits. So the fruit in the Apiaceae family are called schizocarps. These are pretty large fruits as fruits go in this family. So the look-alike here, of course, is golden Alexander, probably. The golden Alexander is a prairie species, grows in wet mesic prairies. It looks somewhat like this in terms of at least the yellow flowers and compound umbels. The fruits are smaller on golden Alexander. The leaves are smaller and a little bit different looking on it as well. But that's, again, one you'd want to be able to distinguish. Be sure you can separate wild parsnip from golden Alexander so you're not mistakenly killing golden Alexander. This one, remember, is got some a photoactivated toxin that is pretty severe for most people in terms of their sensitivity to it. It doesn't bother me, so that's why I can touch it like this and show it to you. All right, then we're going to take a look at another invasive species, and I would say that parsnip is very invasive and a problem to control. Here's another invasive species, one that was brought here though for the purpose of forage production. This is bird's foot trefoil, Lotus corniculatus. This is going to be a problem most likely in more grassy areas and grasslands and in pasture areas. It's a perennial plant, so it's not necessarily very ruderal in nature. There's not very much of it here in this old field, but it's pretty distinctive. The legume flowers here, so legumes have a pretty distinctive flower that has one petal. I'm trying to separate these off here. So here's a single flower right here. The large petal right there that stands upright is called the banner petal. And legumes in this particular section of the family have this type of flower, have a large banner petal that kind of signals the pollinator to come over here. So the flowers are pretty distinctive. The plant has compound leaves, as most legumes do. It's got very large stipules. So these two structures here, we either interpret those as stipules, or we can interpret them as leaflets, I guess, at the base of a sessile leaf. Either way, there's usually 5 structures, 5 leaflet-like structures represented in each leaf. Bird's foot trefoil is a really problem species. It's a perennial, so it's very difficult to get rid of. We can talk about some control measures for it as well. But perennials are always going to be harder to deal with. For a perennial, you're going to have to try to kill the root system. For an annual or biennial, again, remember the strategy is to just stop it from producing seed.
Okay, we don't have any questions, but do we want to talk about management, or do we want to continue, just show the rest of the video and then talk about management of the species?
Well, I'll mention bird's foot real quick.
Okay.
Again, it won't. I can make it pretty short. That's definitely a challenging one. It's going to be a problem species wherever it is. I see it in prairie reconstructions a lot. I've got quite a bit of it here on my own farm that I'm dealing with, and I've tried some different things, and I think from my experience, again, what I think is going to work the best, I'm going to try it this year, is to do a burn in mid to late summer. I did this a couple years ago on a section I was going to put some forb seed in, as I was going to try to diversify. It was mainly just grasses, and I want to try to diversify it. I did the burn in mid to late summer as a way of stressing the warm season grasses, because I wanted to kind of suppress them somewhat to help the forbs that I'm going to seed the following spring or over the winter months. And at the same time, I'm also burning the bird's foot trefoil that's there, and also the wild carrot. And so the burning at that time really was stressful on the bird's foot trefoil. And at the time I thought, well, I'm going to see what happens. I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm just going to see if the combination of stress, because again, it's burning it right in the middle of the growing season there, and it was just coming into fruit or just finishing up. Some of it was actually still in flower. It regrew a little bit, but not very much at all. I thought maybe the combination of the late summer burn plus the winter stress might be enough to do it in. So I didn't spray any of it, and I found out that didn't work. That bird's foot trefoil was able to survive that just fine. I've got just as much of it now as I did before. The one caution you have with bird's foot trefoil, and you can view this as either positive or negative in a sense, is that burning the area will help to increase the germination of it from the seed bank. Now that could be something you don't want to have happen, I suppose, or it could be something you want to have happen in a sense, because you want to get rid of that seed at the beginning. So it's sort of the same strategy that I talked about with sweet clover, pulling that seed out of the seed bank and getting the plants to grow, but then you have to make sure you kill the plants. What I'm going to do now is burn it in, again, mid to late summer, because it does have that effect on the vigor that year. But now I'm going to come back in the fall then and spot spray those clumps of plants. And I'm probably going to spot spray with clopyralid. Again, that's that transline chemical, which again has really good effect on plants in the Fabaceae family. Another one that I would say though that you should consider, and I've not used it, but I'll probably get some, is Milestone. Milestone has let's see, it has a its active ingredient is an aminopyralid, and I think the trade name Milestone is a herbicide that I think many land resource managers have found to be pretty effective. Again, in dealing with these really hard to control plants like birchwood or townbed or some of the other broadleaf species. So I might try some of that and compare that with clopyralid and see how each of those work.
And Tom, we have a question from Jennifer. Do you kill all bird's foot trefoil? I have it along a driveway and by a prairie and in her yard.
I don't think you need to kill it everywhere. I mean, I don't think it probably has great seed dispersal. I'm definitely going to kill it in my prairie. I don't want it there at all. But if there was some in a brome grassland someplace that, or, again, along in a roadside or along a lane, along a slope or something, I mean, it's a good pollinator plant, I'm sure. It flowers for a long time. It's pretty good at erosion control. It, of course, was introduced as a forage species because of its value there. So I think, again, in the right place, I think it's fine. I wouldn't worry about it, but I don't want it in my prairie at all because it is very good at taking up space and preventing native species.
All right, thank you, Ben. Let's keep the video going.
Well, I wanted to stop and talk about this plant right here because this is one we do see scattered about in our landscapes, usually in, again, early successional environments, rural types of environments. This is a non-native. This is Verbaxcum thapsus, or common mullein. It is, again, a pretty easy plant to recognize because of its leaves. You have these really large, kind of soft, lots of pubescence on these leaves. So once you get a good gestalt on these leaves, again, it's a pretty easy plant to see and know. It is, again, it's a biennial. And I wanted to point out, again, in this particular individual, again, what the strategy of a biennial is. So a biennial is a species, a group of plants that we call monocarpic. Monocarpic means that they just reproduce once. So an annual or a biennial is a monocarpic species. A biennial lives for 2 years. And so the first year, you would not see all of this plant. You're just going to see just a rosette, a group of basal leaves. The plant's going to be low on the ground, just producing this cluster of large leaves like this right near the ground. It will grow like that during its first year after germinating from seed. What it's doing that first year is, again, doing photosynthesis as much as possible with those big leaves, storing as much energy as they can into a large taproot. That root lives through the winter and into the next growing season. And in its second year of life, then, the energy reserves in that root, as well as the energy that's achieved from some photosynthesis, are used to produce a large, tall flowering structure. The goal of a monocarpic perennial is to store up energy over at least the first year of its life, produce as much energy and store that energy and save that energy until the second year of its life, then use that energy as a resource along with, again, energy it can muster from photosynthesis during its second year to produce a gigantic tall stem with lots and lots of flowers on it. This is just packed with flowers. Each of these little bumps right here, green little bumps, is a flower. Not all of them are open. Some of them are, most of them are not. So there's hundreds of flowers here in this thick column, and it's also very tall. So you can see how tall it is. So again, the monocarpic perennial is putting all of its energy into reproduction at the end of its life. The idea here is that by doing that, it can accomplish two things. Produce huge amounts of seed by producing huge amounts of flowers. Each flower, again, will produce fruits with a certain number of seeds inside the fruit. I don't know for sure what the number of seeds are on a capsule of rubascum. I'll look it up so we can talk about it later. So achieving high fecundity, or high number of offspring, high number of seeds, is one of the benefits of being a monocarpic plant. The other is that it is able to produce this tall, gigantic stem. And so it can elevate the flowers way above the rest of the vegetation on this tall stalk. That's going to help it attract pollinators. So it can compete against other plants for pollinators by being more visible, being more accessible to them flying about. And then it's sort of a third thing that goes along with this tall, being very tall, is that, of course, when it does open up its capsules and release seeds that are released from higher up on the plant might have a tendency to disperse further away than plants that are released lower. So everything it's doing here, this monocarpic choice in terms of how it's going to reproduce, is aimed at producing lots of seeds, getting pollinated and producing lots of seeds, and then dispersing them far and wide. All right, let's take a look at a tree here. So this is I would say is a pretty invasive woody species. You might recognize the fruits here and the leaves. This is white mulberry. There's the fruits. They begin sort of whitish, and then they turn reddish. Then they turn more of a dark purple. And that's when they're ripe, ready to eat. They are certainly good to eat. Here's typical leaves of a white mulberry, simple leaves. Usually the smaller leaves are highly lobed. Sometimes you can see some leaves that are less lobed. Here's a branch up here. Yeah, that one's pretty lobed as well. The lobing will vary a little bit in terms of how much sunlight it has. If the leaves are more in the sun, if the plant's more in the sun like this one, then the leaves are going to tend to be more lobed. If the plant's more in the shade, then there'll be less. But there is a native species of mulberry, the red mulberry, that again you need to be able to distinguish. It's always almost the case, again, that for every sort of bad, nasty, invasive species, there's probably going to be a native species that resembles it or looks similar to it. So that's why it's so imperative to know, maybe get a list of those similar species so that you know that you need to be on the watch for those native species. So for red mulberry, again, it's the native one that grows in floodplain forests. You're going to separate the white mulberry from the red mulberry best by looking at the bottom side of the leaf. I'm going to just check this one out here. I'm going to look at the ventral surface. I'm going to fold the leaf over like that so I can look across the surface there with my hand lens. Because what I'm looking for is little hairs. Now, white mulberry only has hairs around the veins. The area between the veins, there's no hairs on it. So when you look at again, hold the leaf like this and kind of look at the edge there, you don't see any hairs until you come to a vein. Right around the veins, there'll be a few hairs coming off of the vein. Red mulberry there'll be hairs all the way across there. So there's hairs, small hairs that are present in between the veins. That's the best way to separate red mulberry from white mulberry. Generally, you can get some clue by just the shape of the leaves. Red mulberry usually doesn't have quite as much lobing. Sometimes just has one major lobe, a thumb lobe. But really the lobing is pretty, does vary a lot on both species depending upon the environment the tree is in. So again, the best way is to look at the bottom side and look for those hairs. White mulberry, again, I would put in the category of being invasive. It is easily spread by birds, of course, by endozochory, birds dispersing the fruits. And it grows pretty quick and can become a problem. I've seen many areas that have far too many white mulberry trees. All right, the one over to the right of the mulberry up there, you can maybe see it there, is that is common elderberry. That's a native shrub species that grows in usually wet soils. It's a little bit too high for me to reach, I think, there. Maybe I can grab a leaf here. Here we go. So this is a native species. It's certainly not invasive or anything like that, but since it's here, I thought we'd just quick take a look at it. So mulberry has opposite leaves that are compound. Here's a leaf, here's a leaf, opposite each other, once pinnately compound. Leaflets are elliptic with some small teeth along the margins. Here's the flower, kind of a flat spreading panicle. Panicle is a type of inflorescence that's just highly branching. So lots of branches in here with flowers coming off the final small branch segments. Small little white flowers. The pith on elderberry is white. So I break open the stem here and look at the pith, which is the tissue right in the center of the branch or the stem. That's kind of a clear white. Sambucus canadensis. And mulberry is Morus alba. I got one more species we can take a look at here, and this one is a species of wetland areas. Again, sort of places that have water table near the surface, soil that's at least muddy. It's a very small little plant. It's this one right down here that's all dried up right now, so it's done. It's a annual species, so it's done making its seeds and is already died back. This is Veronica peregrina. It's called speedwell, common speedwell. It's again a pretty common wet soil species. Could be found in stormwater basins, certainly places where there's muddy soil. It's not really, very invasive due to its small size. It's an annual species. It kind of comes in quick and covers the ground, produces flowers, produces seeds, and then dies back. It's a pretty easy one to learn to identify, especially when it's in fruit right now. You take a hand lens and look at the fruits. The fruits are found in the axils of the leaves. So there's leaves here along where each of these fruits are located. So again, there's a fruit associated with each leaf in a sense. And the fruits are heart-shaped. They're kind of flat and have this very distinct heart shape to them. Veronica peregrina.
Okay, Tom. We have one question on the mulberries. Can you distinguish between white and red mulberries by growth structure? Is one more shrub-like?
Generally not. You can a little bit on their bark. I mean, if you can't reach the leaves, that's a problem. And sometimes you can't reach the leaves. So white mulberry does usually have, I mean, they both can be, are generally going to be trees. Neither of them really grows as a shrub. Now, you can make any tree kind of grow as a shrub if you cut it, enough, or if it's burned enough, but that doesn't usually happen, of course. So, but the bark on white mulberry tends to have more of an orange undertone to it, just a little bit more of an orange coloration that you can see, especially in the places where the bark's a little bit thinner, maybe even in the thicker bark that's lower down, maybe in the areas between the ridges. You can see some little bit of an orange touch in those places. So I think that would help give you a clue, maybe which one you've got if you can't reach the leaves.
Good question. I've heard that white and red mulberries can cross breed and create a hybrid. Can you touch on this?
Well, I've not. I wouldn't doubt that because plants do hybridize a lot. I haven't, I guess, verified that in my own work or seen an example where I was sure that was the case. Although, I mean, there are certain times when you're looking at one and it's hard to decide which one you may have, and that's usually then that could be the case where you're looking at a hybrid between the two. So I don't know for sure. I'd have to look up, I guess, and see if Flora of North America recognizes a hybrid or not. A lot of times with trees and plants, when a hybrid does form between two separate species, and it's known that those two species can self-pollinate each other across and produce at least a viable living offspring. It may not be fertile, but at least is able to live and survive like a mule. With plants, it becomes more of a problem or an issue because those hybrids can persist for years and years and years as a plant, especially as a tree, and they can reproduce vegetatively. So they don't, even if they're not able to sexually reproduce because of the hybrid nature, they can asexually reproduce and persist in the environment. So a lot of times then when plants do that and they form a hybrid, that tends to be seen quite often in the environment, and you have to sort of recognize that the hybrid is actually named. The name will be a genus species name, but there'll be we use an X in between a genus and species name to indicate that this is a hybrid species of two parent species. So I'd have to look it up and see if it's recognized as a hybrid or not. I mean, in some cases, the hybridization maybe is so rare or so infrequent that it's not considered to be that important. But not. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it is possible, because it's generally pretty possible for a lot of plants to do that.
Okay, thank you. We have less than 5 minutes. If you could just touch real briefly on the management of the species that you had discussed in the video.
Oh, well, all of them. Real briefly, I guess, again, I've just reiterate the basic strategy has to be different, whether you're dealing with an annual or biennial or if you're dealing with a perennial. When I was talking about the common mullein there, I was using the term monocarpic. Again, means that it just reproduces once. All of those species, again, any kind of monocarpic, whether it's an annual or biennial or a perennial, there are some monocarpic perennials. I think I used the term monocarpic perennial there. Common mullein is really more of a biennial, although it's possible that it might live for 3 years, and then it would be a monocarpic perennial. But other famous monocarpic perennials are things like agave or century plants or bamboos that can live for dozens of years. They live for maybe 100 years, and then they reproduce at the end of their life. Any of those species, again, the strategy always has to be to not let seed production occur. And we talked about ways you can do that. For the perennials, the strategy has to be repeated stress, often involving multiple strategies. I think mowing, fire, an herbicide are the three main strategies. Grazing is another possibility there in situations where you've got, you know, the fencing and the water and the logistics to make it work, but not all of us are going to be able to do that. So, you know, it's stressing the plant over and over and over again, multiple times when growing season, and then again, I think sort of the final strategy being something that's really effective towards the end of the growing season that would sort of, you know, put the final touches on that plant and really cause enough stress to the root system to actually kill the plant. Because until you kill the root system, you know, you haven't really. You may have reduced its ability to flower and produce seed, but you still have the problem until the plant's actually dead.
Okay. All right. Wow, great information, Tom. So thank you, all of you, for joining us today on our Eastern Iowa tour. Next session in July, we're looking at going just west of Des Moines. So stay tuned on that one. Want to thank you, Tom, for your time and expertise. Thank you, Ben, for your behind the scenes transitions into the video. Have a great day, everyone, and we will see you in July.